Why is there so much focus on the critical infrastructure for this hemisphere by the Chinese? Why?
That was General Laura J. Richardson, the U.S. military's SouthCom commander and senior director for Western Hemisphere Affairs on the National Security Council. She was speaking last month at a Hemispheric Security Conference at the Gordon Institute for Public Policy at Florida International University in Miami.
Why in deep water ports? Why in energy? Why in 5G? Why in safe city, smart city technology? Why in space? I worry about it from a military application because of the possible dual use nature. So you have the state-owned enterprises from the PRC that are controlled by the government. And I worry about being at those businesses flipping and being used for military application in critical infrastructure.
We're going to take a look at some of that with journalist Stephen Sefton, whose home in Esteli, Nicaragua, is within the purview of General Richardson's command. Stephen, what's been going on there?
One of the striking features that I've noticed over the last couple of months is the increasing stridency in the tone of remarks by General Laura Richardson, the head of the United States military Southern Command, in relation to what she has stated to the Senate, the US Senate, in testimony. She calls it the malign influence of China and the Russian Federation. A little while ago, we were looking at the way Argentina, under the government of Javier Milei, has made a very strong shift towards emphasizing its alliance, not just with the United States, but it's even been welcomed by NATO. And recently, Laura Richardson was in the southernmost port, I think it's the world's southernmost port, Ushuaia, down near Antarctica, that is right on the Tierra del Fuego and the Straits of Magellan. And a writer I was looking at earlier this morning commented that one of the reasons for that is that the United States is not just interested in ensuring its access to the natural resources of the region, but also it's one of the strategic choke points, is what the writer described it as, for maritime trade between the Atlantic and the Pacific. And if you look at that, what that means is that the United States is trying to reinforce its control of strategic choke points in the Western Hemisphere, in the continent of Latin America and the Caribbean. So they control the Panama Canal effectively. And it's worth noting that the Nimitz-class aircraft carriers, one of which the George Washington is currently on patrol, I think not far from Argentina, they cannot pass through the Panama Canal. They're too big. So if those aircraft carriers want to pass from the Atlantic to the Pacific, they can either take the Canadian Northwest Passage or they go via the Magellan Strait in Tierra del Fuego. So that's one thing to look at in terms of United States strategic thinking and the way they're thinking in terms of preventing China from engaging in any militarily significant actions in the region. And in relation to that, it's worth noting that I've been working on an article about China's impact on Central America over the last 3 or 4 weeks. And one of the things that China has always emphasized ever since, I think it was back in 2016, there was a China-Latin America forum, or 2017, a China forum with the community of Latin American and Caribbean states. And back then they made very clear that they had 4 kinds of priorities for their development cooperation with Latin America and the Caribbean, one of which was infrastructure development, among other things. And if you look at that particular issue in relation to Central America, El Salvador, in Honduras, in Nicaragua, and in Panama, and to some extent in Costa Rica, China is looking at infrastructure projects that will dramatically improve the interconnectivity between the Atlantic and Pacific coasts of the Central American isthmus. So, for example, in Honduras, they're in the initial phases of projects that will improve the connectivity between the port of San Lorenzo on the Gulf of Fonseca and the Puerto Cortes up on Honduras's Caribbean coast. In El Salvador, they're looking at developing port infrastructure also on the Gulf of Fonseca, a port called La Union. In Nicaragua, of course, it's wrong to dismiss the construction of the Interoceanic Canal. But apart from that mega project, in Nicaragua, China is also in the early stages of developing an intercontinental railway and also developing the Pacific port of Corinto. Whereas I think another set of investors are developing the Atlantic port, the Caribbean port of Bluefields. But the Chinese are going to build a railway, an interoceanic railway connecting both those ports. And down in Costa Rica, they're doing something similar. They're improving the connectivity between the capital San Jose and the port of Puerto Limon on Costa Rica's Caribbean coast. And in Panama, they're looking at the possibility of building a railway city going over 300 kilometers to the west to the city of David, which is very close to the Costa Rican frontier. Now, all those things, and if you look at all those projects, they're going to dramatically increase the commercial transport potential of the whole Central American region, once they eventually happen. And at the same time that that's happening, in Nicaragua, China is building a brand new international airport capable of taking intercontinental flights just north of the Nicaragua's capital, Managua. And so when you look at all that, which eventually is likely to turn into a hub able to compete even with Panama's airport, Panama City's airport. And when you look at all that, that's obviously something that the United States has no control over, and is something that's going to dramatically increase the autonomy and the commercial options, the export options for the Central American countries. It's also interesting that I think it was last week, the Chinese authorities announced, the Chinese port authorities in the huge port of Tianjin, I think that's on the northern coast of China, on the Pacific Ocean. They opened up commercial routes to Ecuador, to Peru, and to Chile, dedicated commercial routes that hadn't existed before. And they've also opened up a dedicated commercial route to Nicaragua. And the first vessels sailing on that maritime route have already set off, and they're carrying the machinery that China's going to use to build the international airport in just north of Managua. So when you look at all that, you can see that what Lara Richardson's talking about is that the United States just can't compete with that. And so what they're doing is they're trying to kind of compensate for their inability to compete economically and commercially by beefing up their military control. If you read press or media comments on infrastructure, Chinese infrastructure development in the region generally, or Central America in particular, but for example on Nicaragua's Interoceanic Canal, they'll dismiss it. They'll say it's all pie in the sky, but the Chinese are thinking 10, 20, 30 years ahead.
Having seen some of the cities in China, particularly in the interior, Urumqi and Dunhuang, I don't doubt their ability to do anything, basically. It's quite amazing. Right. So, all right, Stephen, thank you for this. We will follow what goes on in the region there, of course, and speak with you again next week.
Thanks a million, Don. Look forward to it.
So do I. For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.